Okay, so I don't know if you've seen recently, but I came across something that it's gone pretty viral. Thousands of people went to watch a conversation on stage at the OTO Arena a few months ago between Sam Harris, famous atheist author, and Jordan Peterson. In fact, it got to a point where they decided to ask the audience whether they should stop to take questions by way of applause. And they said, should we stop or should we carry on? If you think we should stop, cheer now. A few people cheered. And then he said, if you don't want questions, you just want us to carry on talking, cheer now. And the place erupted. They were desperate to hear more. But I'd like to, I guess, analyse some of the things that came up in the conversation and ask what you thought and hear your thoughts on one of the particular issue that I found fascinating. The idea was as follows. Sam Harris challenged Jordan Peterson, and he said the idea that religious people, Jordan Peterson is a Christian, the idea that anyone from any religion should take one book to be more authoritative than any other book is very dangerous. The example he gave was if he's reading Freud and particularly enjoying it, and then came across an idea that he found that he didn't like and found challenging, he would turn the page and it's not an issue. But the notion that there's one book that you can't do that to because every page has some kind of supreme authority is dangerous, leads to extremism and terrorism, and needs to be eradicated from the, I guess, world of ideas. And I wanted to hear, perhaps, before we get on to what Jordan Peterson's response to that was, what would the Jewish response be to that, the idea that we look at one particular book and say that this is not like any other book? There's something more authoritative, in some sense dogmatic, that gives it a kind of supreme status above all other books.
Well, I'm trying to, I mean, the sense that some books are more authoritative than others, I think, is a given. What I mean by that is if you're reading 5 books on physics, 4 of which are written by someone who's never done a physics degree and 1 of which is written by a Nobel Prize winner in physics, 1 of which represents the broad scientific consensus and the other 4 don't, then I think you've got to take that more authoritatively. As much as we never like arguments from authority, and we should be skeptical about them, so-and-so says at the end of the day, the reason is because humans are fallible, but we still use authority. We do it in medicine. We do it in everything, right? When you want to learn something, you go online. You want to make sure your source authoritative. You got more authoritative websites, less authoritative. More authoritative opinions, less authoritative. So if we believe God wrote something, yeah, that is going to be pretty authoritative. So I guess if you're starting from a Sam Harris point of view that God never wrote it, then obviously giving a human written book infallibility has a risk. But if you believe that God wrote it, then I think that's the bit you got to question. But if you think that's true and you think you've got a good reason for thinking that, then obviously it's got more authority. But I would say something else. In terms of being dangerous or not dangerous, I think history actually has a long history of clearly human authored books being incredibly dangerous. You know, Marx never meant Das Kapital to be dangerous, but somewhere in the world it became an incredibly dangerous, or an inspiration for people who were incredibly dangerous. Adolf Hitler, nobody thought he was getting divine inspiration, or whether Mein Kampf was the thing, or his speeches, somehow they carried the power to be incredibly dangerous. So I don't think it's legitimate to say, I don't think there's even evidence that books people take to be divine or human is the key determinant to whether they're dangerous or not, regardless of whether they're true or not. I'm just not sure if it's true. I think humanity suffered a tremendous amount of books and non-books that are not, that are clearly human done. And conversely, they're probably, I mean, there's a lot of divinely claimed texts. I mean, I don't know anyone who's ever killed anybody in the name of the book of Isaiah. I couldn't imagine how that could possibly even happen, whether they believed it was divine or not. There's clearly extremists around who've killed people in the name of religions and texts they believe give them the authority and license to do so. I don't know people who learn Torah today who believe they have a license to kill anybody. There probably are people like that out there, but I don't know of any personally. And I certainly don't know a single mainstream rabbinic source that sanctions the killing of anybody. So that's I'm not sure that's hit the right distinction. I get why he's worried about religious extremism, but I don't think that's a particularly useful distinction, or one that's got any enough empirical evidence to say that's the distinction.
So perhaps the reframing that Jordan Peterson did, I think, might be helpful as well. What he did was he said it's not the texts themselves that are dangerous, but obviously the interpretations of them. To which the response from Sam was then, you're right, but if the interpretation is locked into a specific system of interpretation, let's say that interpretation was literalism, then it can become dangerous. So he said it was a kind of a coupling between the authority given to the text and the authority given to a specific interpretation of the text that created this whole society of people that thought the text was saying one thing and didn't leave space for, I guess, social morality or the kind of the whims of the people or the society that they're living in to dictate and say, no, that's beyond the pale, that's outside our realm of morality. So when it comes to Judaism, I guess the question we have to ask is, who has the monopoly over what is an authoritative interpretation of the text versus not? So my perspective is that Judaism differs in some sense from every other tradition in that our text and its tradition are not viewed as separate authorities. It's not there's a group of people who have more authority than others in their interpretation, but that the text was given with an interpretation. And generally we call that as oral and written, but I'd like to hear whether that is something that you believe is unique to Judaism, and two, whether you can develop that idea into something that perhaps someone from the perspective of Sam Harris would kind of relate to and understand and see the beauty of it.
Okay, so let me think about that. If you're asking, do I think Torah Shabbat, I think Oral Torah is very special, very unique, and radically shifts the way we relate to the text. The answer is yes. But if you're asking specifically about this question, now I have to confess, I have in my past seen quite a few Sam Harris things and some Jordan Peterson ones. I'm just not up to date, and I haven't followed this, and I'm just crazily swamped. But if it is as you say, and that's the issue, I don't think the Torah Shabbat has the help, and I think Sam Harris hit the wrong nail on the head, and I'll tell you why. Let's take violence in the name of Christianity. And again, I'm not a historian. A historian could do a better job. But here's a plausible scenario that you look for, where does it begin? Early years of when Christianity took over the Roman Empire, there's kind of a broad trend towards towards more pacifism. Apart from the political need for military and stuff, there's less gladiatorial combat. There's a lot of other things. And then at certain points, religious conflict re-emerges. In Christian religious conflict, I suspect it's one of the earlier conflicts is the Crusades, which is some kind of counter to the broad encroachment on Christendom from the Islamic conquerors. And I suspect that they could not find, there wasn't a verse in the New Testament that made people say, this is it, we clearly got to do it. It's coming from the church, which is applying an interpretation to the text. Or some kind of application, not even of the text, but the principle of the need to defend Christianity and keep sites holy. So there, it's actually not the text that does the work. It's the interpretive tradition, and not even the interpretation of the text tradition. It's the systems and the political structures that have been set up that are trying to protect themselves, and they feel their empire is sacred. But secular empires also protected themselves with violence. And even if they didn't use the word sacred about it. So I'm just not sure that captures the distinction. I suspect very few people killed because they thought the New Testament told them to kill. They killed people because they thought the importance of making the world Christian necessitated a killing. Do you see the difference? So there's other forms of thought conformity in the world, but there's, I'm not a defender of the New Testament. But you don't need a rich oral tradition to do it. You just need... So political structures do sometimes kill in the names. Now, of course, if they believe they've got divine purity to their ideology, that might create more of a motive to kill people who think differently. But I think communist Russia is a good example of lots of people being killed because they thought differently. So I just don't think these are the right distinctions. I think he's tapping onto something worrying about certain religious traditions, or let's say, perhaps Salafi Islam or some parts of it, specifically jihadi interpretations of Islam, and in the past, inquisitional interpretations of Christianity. And in some cases, I think those people do link back to their source texts. It's not, some people think, let's say in the Islamic world, I think Sam Harris thinks this way, that if you're more religious Muslim, you've got to be more violent, or you're a better Muslim, at least there's a strong reason for that. There's a very, very rich interpretation world in their world that's very religious and doesn't see the world that way, or reclassifies what's called Dar al-Harab, what is called this thing you're fighting against. What happens if it tolerates Islam? That's fine. What happens if it's governed by treaties? That's fine. Which makes for a much more, what we would call, moderate interpretation. So I'm not sure And then when you move away from that, so let's say Hindu texts or Jewish texts or Christian, I just don't think these are the right distinctions. I'm sorry. So I think you're hitting something that, yeah, if you want to talk about Oral Torah, I'm happy to talk about it. Is that the answer to this question? I don't think so, because I'll give you, sorry, I'm not talking too much here, but I'll tell you why I think so as well. Because suppose the issue is oral tradition, and the beauty of Judaism as an oral tradition, but what's the content of the oral tradition? If part of the oral interpretation is go and kill people, that would be very dangerous. Do you see? So it's not whether it's written or oral. It's not whether it's literal or non-literal. It's not even whether it's believed to be divine or human. It's what is the content of the belief that's being driven across the society.
So I guess that segues perhaps into a point that I was thinking when I was watching them talk, and that is to make a distinction between violence, religious violence, which is what we're talking about until now, and other areas of ethics which aren't necessarily to do with violence, but a particular religious text might promote something which is, I guess, an ideal or a value that modern society or a different tradition would say is totally wrong and immoral or unethical. And that's where I like to challenge in my head when I'm watching and say, that's very nice to say that certain things are very obviously evil. But there are certain other areas of life when it comes to more nuanced ethics and morals where the question is always, how do you know which way to go where it's less obvious? And I guess within a system where you don't accept any authority outside of human written book and every book is just man-made and every value system is man-made, the hierarchy of those different values becomes totally arbitrary. And I'm interested whether you would think that challenging this school of thought, Sam Harris's atheistic perspective in this vein is a good, sensible idea, and challenge them and say, how do you place the hierarchy on those different values when it comes to the more nuanced areas of life? How do you decide which way? We're not talking about killing people anymore. We're talking about very real questions of ethics that come up in our day-to-day life, whether it's in the workplace or at home, or how we treat people, or how we tolerate other people's choices and things like that. My suspicion and my question to him would be, you have no compass in that area at all. You have no way of saying this is more correct or more right or wrong. And it's interesting, he deals a lot with this particular question in his book, The Moral Landscape. But I'm interested to hear whether you think that that line of questioning against someone who shares his beliefs is something that you think would go very far.
So I think it actually depends what you're trying to achieve in that line of questioning. If you're asking simply the question, which is a legitimate question, if you don't have a divine text or system, how do you decide what's right or wrong? Well, the answer to that, I think, is relatively straightforward, and we have a better understanding of it nowadays. It's going to be consensus. There's going to be societal consensus, and they shift, and you can have, within a single society, differences of opinion, differences in the types of moral intuitions that people feel broadly connect to or not. Often they'll devolve into tribal behavior, ironically, because part of what most ethical thinking involves is transcending tribal values and spreading them. And somewhat ironically, if you take the modern landscape, what ends up happening is people become committed to tribal commitments to moral issues. I'll give you an example. In American politics, and it might, in some degree, hits parts of Europe, it might become in England sooner or later as well, you get this, you're liberal or conservative. And what's actually happened since the 1980s is that increasingly, let's say the Republican and Democrat Party are not defined primarily by the economic philosophies, but primarily by, or at least the voters who are very ardent, are increasingly linked to what they consider themselves, use words like liberal or conservative to define their social views, and then they find themselves supporting foreign policy or economic views on those bases. But at the root of both camps are deep moral instincts, right? So liberalism is the sense of the individual as first. There is a moral part of our brain that thinks about, in empathetic terms, to the need of the individual above all else. Then there is conservatives who look at things like family, community, tradition, stability in moral decision making. That's also actually part of our instincts. In fact, there's Jonathan Haidt wrote this whole, about a lot how different moral instincts arrive. So what would an atheist say? Fine, yeah, we kind of, society does shift, it does change, which values become more dominant, how does it change, complex sociological processes, challenging of traditions, iconoclastic things, perhaps when there's a sense of failure in society, there's the ability of a new generation to come in, there's all sorts of psychological, sociological processes, and we reach these moral consensuses. Now what you would legitimately then ask on them is, okay, but how do you have the right to tell somebody else they're wrong? And I think Sam Harris does try to do this by trying to come up with this pain calculus. I don't know if it works or not. There's an interesting debate with him, William.
Right, it's an interesting redefinition of morality to well-being.
Yeah. Well, no, morality to promoting overall well-being. That's what the utilitarians have always come to go down.
Societal as opposed to individual.
Yeah, yes, correct. Or you could look at it as the individual in front of you have greater. You don't have to take a purely consequentialist view. You can also include the responsibility you have to the person in front of you. You can build models that way. Whether that's right or wrong, the biggest question, I think one of the big questions on it is going to be something like, what happens if what we would all consider the wrong thing to do made people happier?
Right.
And there's many examples you can come up with that. Yeah, killing one person in the world just made the whole, right? You could argue as a lot of people in America would be really happy if someone went and killed Donald Trump, right? You could argue that if a nuclear bomb went off in Tel Aviv, lots and lots and lots of people on planet Earth would be really happy. So okay, and then there's kind of, okay, but you may say, but actually aggressively versus passive, what happens if you have information that could stop that nuclear bomb going off? The question is, do you pass that on to somebody or not? You can create a lot of moral scenarios where a small number of people relatively being hurt could make a lot of people really, really happy, and yet that would probably be the morally wrong thing to do. So, and there's just some examples of that. So you can question that, but I think the deeper question, you're hitting at something else, which is our instinct seems to tell us that people are really wrong or right. We don't necessarily know what right and wrong are, but we know there is such a thing as right and wrong. That, I think, is a very important philosophical question. Most atheist thinkers bite the bullet on that and say, actually, there isn't really an absolute, but it doesn't necessarily matter because we feel it, and because our brains are programmed that way, and society is that way.
Similar to free will in a sense.
Yeah, if you don't believe in free will. So if one's willing to bite that bullet, you can pressure people very hard to say, you really, really, really don't think Nazism is wrong. And some people bite the bullet and say, ironically today, you usually find a person not willing to bite the bullet on a different issues, right? You feel, because hot button issues today might be more persecution of minorities, racism, homophobia, those sorts of things which people get very, very upset about. And then people often struggle to say, no, I don't think this is a relative value, I think it's an absolute value. And I think if a person does accept an absolute value, absolute means it's a standard against which you can measure human or societal behavior, well, you're implying there's something higher than humans and society. So that's classically been used as some kind of argument for that at least subconsciously we believe, and we can't really break out of something consistent with something higher than all of us. Now again, somebody could say, it's true, we all think subconsciously God exists, but we can consciously doubt it too. So I don't know how far the argument does or doesn't go. I think its most powerful pressure point can get a person to recognize that the basis upon which they base all morality is an assumption that they contradict when they say they don't believe there's anything higher than humans. So how far, what the conclusion of that is, I'm not sure. I think it's better argument for the existence of God, for example, if that's where you're trying to go.
Of course.
But,
so there's a lot of questions swirling in my mind now. I don't think I've watched a video like this before that really challenged me to clarify and crystallize what it is that Judaism differs on and says we've got what to offer in this area of thought and this area of thought. It was beautiful. I very much enjoyed it.
I agree with you. I think these conversations are very important, and too often the world is divided. It's almost become this, like people just throw out lines they read in a book repeatedly insulting each other.
Tell you what they did to start the conversation. It was great. The moderator was actually, what's his name? I can't remember his name now. His name...
the unforgettable...
His moderator. He said he's too moderate to be a moderator. I can't remember what his name was. Anyway, got an image of his face in my head. He introduced them, he challenged them to Iron Man the other person's argument. So instead of setting up what everyone does is straw man and says, you think this and then smash it down, he said, I want each side here to present what they think is the best argument for the other person's position, and then the other person would do the same thing, and that kind of set off the tone for a fantastic audience. And just to the fact, and what they said and what I sensed from watching the video, the fact that thousands of people had paid and taken time, it was and not that, on YouTube it's got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views, 2.5-hour videos, and 5 of them. It gives us some hope for the future of the world, you know.
I say that, I really believe that. I think people write off as like, oh, people today don't think, or people today don't, you know, they're all on social medias, they can't think. Rubbish. You don't think on Facebook, maybe. That's not where you go to think. And if you're just going to absorb ideas like a zombie, fine. But people go to longer things to think. You know, people, or people say people aren't idealistic today. That's rubbish. They might not be idealistic in the way, but anyway, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think people are thirsting for deep discussions about these issues. These are big questions. People have time to think about them. They want to. Not everyone does, but a lot of people do. I agree with you.